to another episode of New Australian Bulletin in cooperation with the Australia First Party. You can check out New Australian Bulletin at www.newaustralianbulletin.com and the Australia First Party at www.australiafirstparty.net. And we have with us, we're proud once again to have with us Britain's longest standing veteran nationalist and all-around current commentator, Nick Griffin. And we have Dr. Saleam from the Australia First Party. And first up, Nick, I'll just say I've been seeing some interesting scenes out of Ireland, which, as everybody knows, is a part of England. That's just a joke. Where the locals are much upset with the migrant scam going on there, but rather than sitting behind keyboards, they're getting very active. I saw a video of one grotty little encampment, pretty much a sort of penned alley that the locals took it upon themselves to go in. I'm not sure which part of Ireland that was in.
That was in Dublin. And it was interesting that the encampment, of course, was set up by an NGO. It was a propaganda stunt. So it's one of the Soros NGOs set it up, and the locals turned up. So did Antifa, a large number of Antifa. They ended up having to be, and they're pretty tough there. They ended up having to be escorted out of the area for their safety by the cops. And the locals then took the camp apart because some of the people in the camp had been abusing and giving trouble to local women. So it's quite remarkable to see, and it's not the only one. And I was looking just today, there's more quite dramatic footage out in County Clare. There's a little town down, one of the little towns down there. It's got a big hotel that, of course, is now being used by the Irish government to house asylum seekers. So local farmers and men turned up, blockaded the whole place off. That ended up with the asylum seekers that arrived a few hours before just apparently demanding a bus, and there's footage of them getting on a bus, taking their belongings and going back to Dublin. So yeah, the Irish are getting pretty militant.
Does that offer hope, you reckon?
Well, it offers hope, of course. It particularly offers hope for Ireland. But there is something very unusual, of course. And I think the Irish are the only white people in the world who haven't been force-fed guilt. You know, the Irish traditionally have been presented as the victims of Brit aggression, etc., etc. So they've got no concept. They were never colonialists. The role of, for instance, Irish mobs in lynching Negroes in New York and things like that has been completely pushed under the carpet. So the Irish are guilt-free, which means that the Irish potentially can do things which other white nations won't do. But there again, monkey see, monkey do. Once things start, it has the potential to spread. So yeah, it does give me hope. And it is really wonderful to see it's not just one or two places. It's not being organized by a political party that can be taken out from the top. This is absolutely grassroots resistance by ordinary, decent Irish people. There's no neo-Nazi stuff. There's a degree of Catholicism shown at some of the demos, you know, going back to their traditional roots. But it's very much organic, and it is of the Irish people, by the Irish people, for the Irish people. It's great to see.
Excellent. Now, Jim has some questions, so I'm going to let Jim dip into his notebook here and lay it on you.
Yes, Nick, obviously your name was mentioned quite extensively recently over the fracas that developed in the British organisation Patriotic Alternative. And I've read, of course, your pamphlet Moths to the Flame. I've read it a couple of times. And, of course, the usual suspects, Searchlight and whatnot, had a lot to say. The question I've had is that you highlighted that there were many decent young kids and others who'd affiliated or were in contact with Patriotic Alternative, and that it was your estimation of things that a certain clique inside that group were going to cause the organisation to be banned. And as you know, it hasn't been banned. Rather, this clique has moved itself out, trying to wreck the organisation on the way out. What's your estimation of what actually occurred in terms of your pamphlet, Moths to the Flame?
It's difficult to say. There's certainly, there's an effort in Britain, sort of in the movement generally, to present this and say, well, yep, it's everything Griffin told you about Smith, and Smith's the wrong one, and here's the bad bunch. This is the new Homeland Party. And the implication is that, Mark Collett and PA are therefore okay. And I said very clearly, no. This was a joint thing right from the start. Smith and Collett are both deeply, deeply dodgy. It's one of those, Ray Hill, the veteran leftist infiltrator of the right, ended up standing, you probably remember, Jim, as the would-be leader for British movement in the early 1980s.
Yes.
And he, in his autobiography, explains how keeping a constant stir of organisation splitting and calls for unity and so on, it all just keeps this spiral of change and debate going so that nothing else happens. And we can see what's happening with what I think essentially is a fake split, because Collett put Smith and the others in that position where they could do what they've done, knowing that they would do what they've done. There's no doubt about it. So it's a fake split, and it's designed just to create this maelstrom of uncertainty and backbiting and so on. So it keeps the whole movement off balance. That at least is the plan. How it's going, you mentioned, Jim, that I'd said that there's a lot of decent young people have been attracted. They have, and I would say that the good thing coming out of this is that I think now the majority of those have seen that neither PA nor the new splinter from it are any good. They're just getting on and doing things themselves. So there's a plethora of local demonstrations, mainly organised against more of the asylum hostels, where of course there is indeed local support by normal people for a nationalist presence in a way that there wouldn't be for anything else really. And they're getting on with this. So every weekend there's demonstrations somewhere or other, which are being attended by a bit of a hardcore it's a sort of national travelling circus of ex-PA, relatively speaking, young people, male and female, and then they're hooking up with people who locally would 6 months ago have said, I'm patriotic alternative, and now they're independent, doing things in their communities. So it's moving in the right direction. But I think that the soap opera of the PA split will simply go on and on and on, taking up the energy and the time of the people daft enough to be involved in it, because of course that was the plan from the very beginning.
I heard that they're merging with the British Democrats.
There's a proposal to merge PA with the British Democrats. Perhaps that couldn't be done while Smith was there. He's so hated, having been crucially involved in the leaking of the BNP membership list. He's so hated. It was okay, one thing for youngsters, because it's ancient history to a 17-year-old, so it didn't matter. But to hook up with the British Democratic Party, which is pretty much it's where the people from the BNP who wanted to carry on the democratic road, in a fairly amateurish way, by the way, but nevertheless, still they wanted to carry on with that, so they've ended up in the BDP. So it's a much older organisation, and everybody in any position in it is aware of what Smith was, so there was no prospect of them having an alliance with PA if he was still there. He's now gone, so there is now that possibility. Amongst them, there's still a great deal of reticence and suspicion about Collett anyway, for the same sort of old reasons, but there's more chance of it happening. And that, again, I come back, it's exactly out of the playbook as described by Ray Hill, that you keep the will they, won't they, let's have discussions going for a year, 2 years. Nothing else happens during that period. So yes, there is talk of this, and I don't believe that it's organic or genuine. It's part of the system, intelligence services control of the nationalist movement. Not, to be honest, that it particularly needs control at present. The system is clearly terrified of the potential public reaction to this new mass wave of immigration. Almost every town now has got a hotel in it, which is now an asylum centre, and the system are scared of that. But the results of the local elections back last month, when every single nationalist party, from the hardest core ones that stand through to UKIP and its splinters, they were all absolutely obliterated. And the worst results, probably, well, even worse actually than the NS results in 1979. And they're just catastrophic election results. Why is it? Well, I think there's a number of reasons, partly because there's now none of these organizations fighting elections properly, which is difficult. Although if the wind of public opinion is in the right direction, you can actually stand a monkey and put out nothing. You do nothing and get a passable vote as long as the local media talk about you. So that isn't there. But I think the key reason is this, that was it now 7 years ago, 17.4 million Brits turned out against all the establishment Project Fear propaganda and all the rest of it and voted for Brexit. And it really was, and this fundamentally, that was swung by the blue collar, middle-aged working class male. People who also tend to vote nationalist. And they did this in the teeth of all this hysteria from the elite, and they genuinely believed that now this is it, they'd done it, they were going to get back control, the government would obey them, and it wasn't really a vote for Brexit, it was a vote to stop the destruction of Britain through mass immigration. That was where it came from. And what's happened? The entire political elite has conspired to block it. So they granted Brexit in name, but nothing's happened. And in particular, the flood of immigrants is even bigger than it was before then, with the added problem that instead of at least reasonably assimilable Poles and so on, you've now got vast numbers of Afghans and Somalis and all the rest of it. So there's this utter disgust on behalf of the people who normally would be available to vote for a nationalist party. And to a degree, the more they're smeared by the systems, media and so on, the more credible they become in that hardcore. But that hardcore is completely disillusioned with the political process because they did this and they've been ignored, they've been spat on. And I was writing the other day that out of that 17.4 million, about 2 million would already have died. That's a bit more than that because that's the demographics. But it still leaves 15 million people who now have got personal experience of being involved in something they thought would create a great change and seeing voting changes nothing. And when you add it, that was in a referendum which could change something. When you're now looking at especially local elections, which clearly, whoever's elected the local council, it doesn't change the direction of the country as a whole. So the people who would have been inclined to vote nationalist simply are not interested. And I think they look at people who come along and say, vote for us, we're going to change the world. They look at them and think,
it's fantastic people, so to speak.
What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
You're either stupid or just a grifter. It's one or the other. But either way, you're not getting my vote. And you multiply that over 15 million people, and the electoral stuffing has been knocked out of the movement in Britain in the same way as it will be actually in the USA, when if Trump gets his next nomination and then loses, and if he couldn't win when he was in power, how's he going to win when he's not in power, when the demographics have shifted even more, with more elderly white Americans dying and millions more illegal immigrants being given the vote? The same's heading for the USA, that after that election next year, the people's belief in the electoral process will have gone. Now, this isn't a black pill, because I think, as you know, for some years now, I've concluded, I think as you have, that the electoral road is a phantasm. It's a distraction from the real things that need to be done. So I would say that we're very close to the time when the time for our message really is coming.
That podcast you did on the, sorry, Jim, I'll hand it back to you in a second. I was going to say, Nick Griffin did a brilliant podcast on the futility of the electoral road. I've forgotten what you named it.
Tooth Fairy Politics.
Tooth Fairy Politics. And you can find that on your...
You can you can find it on my Telegram page, but I'm going to re-release it. Just as I was saying earlier, I've just finished writing it's about a 3,500 word analysis of the local elections in Britain, and we're going to be putting that out, backed up by a reissue of a slightly updated Tooth Fairy Politics in a week or so's time. I'll let you know, Nathan, when it's up, and you can spread it around, because I know that although the circumstances are different, and the details are different, in broad terms, this picture is true in every white nation in the world, including your Australia.
Indeed. In fact, we have an example here where a candidate for Australia First, who is running an exposure campaign, and a very good one, concerning certain, I'll just say, capitalistic machinations, immigration, the usual subjects in far western Sydney, may well have been cheated out of an electoral win. And so if they don't get you one way, they get you the other. In fact, we noticed that at one stage, several hundred votes had been credited to one of the opposition candidates and then suddenly removed. And I think the only mistake with it is they gave the votes to the wrong candidate. Had they given them to the more successful looking candidate, it might have slipped through. But she was cheated, and I've got very little out of that. But that's another story. But it does augment the point. I think we said once, the old Trotskyites of the International Socialists used to have on their page, there is no parliamentary road. And of course, there is no parliamentary road. And if anyone does electoral work, it's only for the propaganda value, never for the delusion that you may, in fact, actually win. Maybe someone might, but that does not govern the overall course of politics.
Absolutely so.
One point that came up in the recent Patriotic Alternative affair is that, as you may know, a discussion was held between the leader of PA and a local Australian figure, a man I've met once or twice in different capacities, called Blair Cottrell. But Blair, whether rightly or wrongly, has had links with this neo-Nazi group in Australia, which is linked to your national action over there, Attenwaffen, Sonnenkrieg. It was linked to the base in the United States. It was trading on James Mason books there a few years ago, and so on and so forth. And I believe that this group shared the discussion between Blair and Mark Collett. So here's a situation where this group in Australia would be nominally, and I mean nominally in terms of the game, more sympathetic to the homeland group that split away, saluting each other, whatever it is that they do. But on this occasion, they're pretending to be more solicitous of the feelings of the person who's been sinned against in the split. This is bad for Patriotic Alternative because these people will push it. And we have it on very reliable authority that the neo-Nazi group in Australia is going to be banned later in the year. A lot of people have been arrested on various terrorism offences, firearms offences, downloading certain material from the internet offences, all of the things that your pamphlet, Moths of the Flame, warned against. These guys are doing. And it's not just one or two, it's every state where they've ever had a presence. It's not just one, it's several, so on and so forth. And the leader of it's got charges against him. It's our understanding that the Commonwealth Attorney General's Department here has already been drafting up material for the Director General of Australian Security Intelligence Organisation on the ban. Now, if this group is banned from Australia, it has impacts. Sonnenkrieg, Attenwaffen are banned in Australia. This will be part of the ban here. It therefore bounces back to your neck of the woods, where the same things will be said. And once again, this is a disaster. We have the same situation. There's a lot of very young people who've contacted an organisation. It's been their first call ever in politics. They imagine that this thing could be true, that it's selling a valid ideology. Therefore, they do and say things that are not helpful to anybody on any assessment. So here's an example. And it's a bad thing that this interview was done, because whatever the intention of doing it, it won't be the effect. And I would warn your listeners in the UK to watch out for this. These people are quite active online. They join a lot of forums and groups and so on, and they'll be joining some of yours. And so look
very
out.
interesting. Yeah. Well, I watched a couple of minutes of it. I have to say that I thought that Cottrell is at least a better looking and a more amenable character than Collett. I know that many people in Britain felt the same way, which of course adds to the danger, because I don't know, he looked, from a distance, you could even say charismatic. I don't know whether he is or not, but clearly potentially an attractive figure.
Look, Blair was falsely charged a few years ago, along with a couple of other men, over a political stunt, and he had to face court for it and so on. He was not necessarily a founder of this neo-Nazi group in Australia or whatever. But one of the problems that we've found is that there's a lot of sometimes linkages that occur. Blair did know the neo-Nazi leader Thomas Sewell and so forth. There was a predecessor group of the sort, which was a sports group called the Lads Society. They ran gymnasiums in a few cities and so on, and these connections are made. But as I've said to yourself and to others, one of the problems, I suppose, is in the assessment of what this neo-Nazi thing is. In Australia's case, the NSN was partly founded by the Order of the Nine Angles, which I know you're definitely familiar with. No doubt about that. In fact, there's been a lot of controversy online between some young people who came in contact with that group and dropped out of it. Once you've got Order of the Nine Angles, well, you know what follows. And I know Blair Cottrell certainly never had anything to do with that. I'm quite sure Mark Collette never had anything to do with that. But it's a great danger that we actually had it here, and it's still there. So another problem.
Yeah, definitely. So, of course, with the Order of the Nine Angles, you get all these things, the other organisations, Sun and Krieg, et cetera, you've spoken about. Yeah, it's very, very clear that those are system set up, approved and run from beginning to end. There's no question of that. With the Order of the Nine Angles, you've also got the same thing. Obviously, it's promoted. We've seen it in the States, promoted by the FBI. But within it, it's got its own little sinister mafia of people who have their own vested interest in destroying young lives. So it's not the state wanting to suck people in order to destroy them. This is just Satanist vermin wanting to sacrifice and honor Satan by destroying decent youngsters. So it adds to the problem. It's very sordid, very unpleasant. And I'll certainly pass this warning on, because I know that some people in Britain, well, they only see a young Australian who's apparently talking sense. And of course, it's not under these circumstances, and it's perhaps unjust. It's not what you're saying that counts. It's the contacts and the connections and the picture that it allows the state and its prostitute media to draw. But that's what demonizes and justifies the ban and everything that goes with it. So very dangerous thing, and I thank you for your warning.
Well, one question I'd actually say to you, because I'm quite sure the answer you'd give would be a universal answer. Why do you think it is that some people find it so difficult to draw lines in the sand with whom they should speak to or where they should go? Why do you think that is?
I've pondered this a number of times. I suspect it's a consequence of the demonization that we all suffer. When there's an enemy which says, they're not just saying that they're bad, they're also saying to these youngsters that you're bad. So when you've got this mass media and the political elite and teachers at school and all the rest of it slagging everybody off who shares any of these views, I think the natural reaction to that is to sort of, to form a defensive lager. We're all in this together. So they have that phrase, I'm sure you've heard, don't punch right.
Yeah.
So under the guise of unity, we all got to get together. That's a big thing as well, which is partly a natural thing, because obviously you see splits and divisions, and logically it does weaken. But also it's the old Ray Hill thing again, to seek to pollute the state as well. The British state's deepest thing by Brigadier Kitson. The idea of you pollute the water in which the fish swim. Yep. So there's all these pressures pushing people into seeing it as one broad movement. And if you criticize anyone, you're rocking the boat. So even if you have doubts, a lot of people don't criticize. And of course, the minute you do stand up and say what that group is doing is wrong, and look at those people in it, then there's a great deal of criticism thrown at you. Oh, you're being divisive, you're wrecking and all the rest of it. Why can't we all get on? So you put all these things together, and it's very hard, especially for younger people, to stand up against that. When you've reached a certain age, you've got a thick enough skin, and you've already been attacked and demonized so many times, it doesn't really care anymore. I will simply tell the truth, and I don't really care if it annoys people or not. The truth's there, and people deserve a chance to listen to it. If they don't take any notice, then we're in the clear. We've done what we morally can. It then becomes their own stupid personal choice. If they made the wrong choice, that's their problem. So yeah, I think it's a slightly long-winded way of answering a question, Jim, but I hope that does answer it. There's a number of factors, but most of all, I think it's the fact that when you're attacked from outside, it tends to make people think, well, we better stick together, even when in fact it's a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I'd say that the Australian experience is, of course, extremely similar. And there was one interesting one that came to my attention today. There were reports that the Ukrainian Security Bureau boss, his name escapes me offhand, admitted that Ukrainian secret services had carried out actual bombings and attacks in Russia. And for the first time, they admitted playing roles in the murder of Alexander Dugin's daughter and so on. In a discussion with another European nationalist, it was put to me that some of the pollution of the European scene might now actually come out of Ukraine. That is, it could be something driven by Ukraine's security and so on. When I saw this today, it was a strange thing, and it's not necessarily having the old saying, the fact that I'm paranoid doesn't mean to say it's not happening. But it was an unusual one that the connections that Ukraine has developed over the time, or the Ukraine state has developed over time with various right-wing groups and whatnot in Europe, offers the capacity now for a whole new era of mischief making. Would that make any sense to you in context?
Yeah, certainly it would. And this isn't just about, not originally the Ukrainian state. That's making of contacts between Ukrainian nationalists and their particularly hysterically unpleasant version of nationalism that even predates the Colored Revolution. You know, Sloboda, other people like that, the other people have become Azov. They were reaching out and making connections and trying to influence Central and Western European nationalists 10 years ago and more. Now, of course, they've intermerged themselves with the state. So is it them using the state? Is it the state using them? It's a combination. The CIA likewise, using both. So there's all sorts of elements in Ukraine now looking west. And I would guess that's in the early days, 10 years ago, they were looking for support in what they intended to do in Ukraine. I would imagine that by now you must surely have members of the middle and upper echelons of the nationalist groups there, knowing that they've lost that war, knowing that they're likely to end up as political refugees in the West. And I think that they're probably now deliberately setting out to create safe havens and contacts so they can get the hell out. And I'm reminded of speaking with a very long-standing Ulster loyalist patriot a few days ago, who was saying he actually went to a meeting when the peace process was finally imposed, and it was imposed on the loyalists because actually they felt they'd won that war. They were almost in the mopping up stage against the IRA by that point. So when the peace process was imposed on them, most of the men who refused to go along with it were simply assassinated, officially by the IRA, but in fact, almost certainly by the British state, or certainly with their collusion. The same thing also happened with dissident Republicans who didn't want to sit down at the peace table. They were taken out as well. But here's the key point, that this contact of mine was at a meeting of the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, which was one of the two main loyalist paramilitary terrorist groups, which had been fighting, in their eyes, a legitimate war. And when the peace process was imposed, they had a meeting and all their key people got together, and 3 or 4 of them said, right, we made a decision. We are going to become a criminal gang. Are you with us? And most of them said no, they just walked away. Whatever's happened with this peace process, the war is over and we must go back and try to get back to normal lives and build things in our community. But a proportion of them made consciously, having, with the war finished one way or another, and in effect, although they won the conflict towards the end, but they lost the overall war. So having lost the war, they simply set out to take advantage of the machinery they had, the connections they had, the weapons they had, to become a criminal gang. And I think that we're going to see throughout Western Europe, almost certainly Australia as well, anywhere you've got emigration from the collapsing failed state Ukraine, you're going to see what appear to be and what present themselves as nationalist organizations. That's basically a semi-legitimate legitimizing front for pure, very intense criminality, and heavily armed criminality at that. It's going to get very, very dangerous.
Yeah, I was going to say that I've been looking very closely at the infiltration of the Ukraine migrant community here by rampant pro-NATO, pro-US, all the usual sort of shibboleth politics. And a lot of it is somewhat pathological in its hatreds. Similar efforts have been done in other migrant communities here that have been isolated or deliberately isolated from the mainstream Australian white society for a long time. And I think a lot of this goes back in time, as you know, into anti-communist politics in Australia and how it actually worked. The Liberal Party here, our equivalent of your Conservatives, was very, very assiduous in organising particularly Eastern European groups of people to support the anti-communist crusades and so forth. And this is carried on. And some of these communities have kept a grip on some young people over generations, keeping them away from assimilation just into the broader white community. And this has become far more intense here in recent times. And one thing I'll just mention as a bit of a fillip to the debate is going back a long time into the 1970s. There was a very, very well-known person in the Estonian world. And this lady actually provided facilities to nationalists to use advanced typesetting and similar and whatever equipment. And she told us that she'd actually woken up to what was happening inside her own world, that it was very, very heavily manipulated, that the Conservative parties were manipulating it, the security police and everyone to keep these people as a cat's paw on everybody else over social issues. And she was a very well-known lady. She only died a couple of years ago. And she said, if people knew that I was speaking to you in these terms, it would be the end of me inside the group of people in which I move. And this seems to have continued here, that we actually have the pattern not only of criminal gangs, but I'm not saying the majority of the people, like I've met many people of Ukraine background, they wouldn't buy into this for the proverbial barge pole, but there are a large number of people who probably would, whether they are a criminal gang and they go down the criminal road, or whether they go down some sort of organised political road where they might actually be challenging groups who stand up for Australian independence, Australia first. You'll probably find in a couple of years that if we would organise a public meeting saying, well, no Australian should die for Taiwan, this is a trade war, we're not going to do this, these people would turn out and say, well, you know, you're agents of China. Or you're part of, you know, some conspiracy with Vlad the Impaler in Moscow. You know, we're out to get you. This would be a bizarre result, but I can actually see it coming here.
Yeah.
So in our country's case, it goes a little bit beyond criminal gangs. It actually goes into the pattern of migration, but it's the long-standing pattern of social manipulation that's actually been going on here for 60 years. So it's not new.
Interesting stuff.
Now, gentlemen, on the subject of Ukraine, there was a big attack by Russia on an ammunition dump in Ukraine. Did you see the footage of that? Now,
I certainly did. Yeah, it was very interesting. I tweeted about it and so on, and spoke about it on a Templar show, actually, that it was obviously a massive explosion and then series of explosions. And interesting in a number of ways. That was clearly a very substantial NATO arms dump of recently arrived munitions. From the scale of it, quite possibly the long-range cruise missiles, which the British government have just provided. And there's persistent rumours, it may of course be black propaganda from the Russian side, you can't tell, but persistent rumours of high radiation levels showing now in that part of Western Ukraine, implying that there were also depleted uranium shells, which again the British have said they're going to supply. Which is more likely, that the Russians are lying about that, or that given that the British government said, yes, we are going to supply depleted uranium shells, and yes, we've sent them, and the fact that they haven't apparently yet been used on the battlefield, they must logically have been in storage somewhere. And then you see that massive explosion, which the Russians obviously targeted that. I don't know, did you see the before and after aerial footage of that site by chance? I saw pictures of that. That was very interesting. That wasn't one warehouse. That was a whole series. There's about 20 warehouses there. Before and after it, they have all gone. So it was a massive strike, clearly directed by intelligence, and they clearly hit something hugely important, which leads me to believe that in all probability the scale of the explosion was because that was millions upon millions of the most sophisticated cruise missiles the West has going up in flames. And the radiation thing is because likewise they were that really disgusting, despicable anti-tank munition, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is still killing thousands upon thousands of totally innocent Iraqi children more than 20 years after that particular bloody, appalling NATO war.
Yes, I was going to suggest too that having followed the recent stories of US debt defaults, G7 meetings in Tokyo to shore up the Western economies and whatnot, I think we discussed previously that this war is, if taken holistically, it seems that the entire Western economy is now on the battlefield here, and that if this war goes on into winter, and there's a distinct possibility that it will, that it degenerates to some sort of stalemate, that perhaps modern Western weapons maybe fend the Ruskies off and vice versa, and it enters into a stalemate, that the West can't win this with a stalemate. And if there's no result, then the Western system is the one that's in the most danger of some sort of crisis or collapse. Do you sort of generally agree with that sort of assessment?
Yeah, I agree completely with that, Jim. Looking at it, in fact, the fact that the Russians continue basically to fight with one hand voluntarily behind their back and a big glove on the other, and basically leaving this to the Wagner group, with the Russian armed forces playing only a really kind of minor, limited role. So there's to my mind, there's only two possibilities why this is. One, the Russians are actually afraid that if they really get stuck in with their full military in Ukraine, then NATO, and particularly the Poles, will come round through the back door with an attack, an offensive against Russia of their own. Or they simply are pulling their punches because actually they want this war to go on. And why could they possibly want this war to go on? Because it is demilitarizing not just Ukraine now, but the whole of NATO. So you've got I've read in the last few months successively that the Germans, the Dutch, the Italians, the French and the Brits, in different words, have all said, we now couldn't fight a war for more than about 72 hours because we simply haven't got the munitions and the reserves to do it. So it's demilitarizing NATO, and the Russians have got really a choice, haven't they? If they go for a knockout and completely demilitarize Ukraine and finish the war, so then the conflict is frozen, but basically perhaps it might be a bit of a guerrilla war, but in terms of destroying vast amounts of war material, it's not happening anymore. So they can win the little war and demilitarize one part of the enemy. If the war carries on, they're demilitarizing the whole of the enemy. So to me, that's what's going on, because I would have said it's clear that for all NATO's saber rattling into about Belarus and so on, and the Polish army and so on, the Americans couldn't get significant forces over there inside of months. The British don't have significant forces, etc. So I don't in fact believe that there's a realistic chance of a NATO dragging Austin from Poland through Belarus and so on. And I think the Russians must know that. So I think they're deliberately allowing this war to grind on because it's doing a job. And it's certainly demilitarizing NATO. But as you said, also, it's placing a gigantic financial and economic strain on the West. Again, the Russians and the Chinese, the Iranians, etc., they all know that this is now an absolutely existential struggle between their multipolar world and the NATO, Wall Street, Washington, Anglo-Zionist thing. and when you're in an existential struggle, you've got to win it. So you look at how to win it, and running the enemy out of economic capacity and finances is how most wars end, actually, isn't it? Most wars end not through defeat on the battlefield, they end through collapse at home. And I think that's what we're beginning to see looming. And long may, well, not long may it continue, the sooner it comes to an end, the better. But
that's the result of war.
Carry on. Yeah.
Well, that's going to be a question for Ukrainian nationalists, as there must be all three of them left now. I mean, video footage of the graves marking the dead there, and I think I might have got it off your channel, presages the comment about, well, now it's time to open up the floodgates, bring in the Africans, the subcontinentals, etc., and restore the debt system. I think that was a comment you made in regards to an element of the Great Replacement, that it has a component about perpetuating debt, and there's only so much debt you can get out of those present in a society. So by increasing immigration, you enable them to increase debt. Did I get that right?
I think I made some comment to that effect. I mean, I think the biggest push behind it, the biggest push for just mass immigration, but I think probably is a capitalist thing. It's about cheap labour and fresh consumers. The biggest push for the Great Replacement, I think that is an ideological ethnic hatred thing underneath that more than anything else. It's about getting rid of us. And there, I think that what's happening now in Ukraine, self-evidently, the deaths are, it's on such a catastrophic scale, the deaths of young men, and that's compounded by, you've now got already 2 years when vast numbers of Ukrainian young women haven't given birth to any Ukrainian babies because they're living in the West, and their men aren't there, and if they're having anyone's babies, it's not their own. So it's creating a demographic black hole in what is actually the center of Eurasia, into the geopolitical terms. And having created a demographic black hole, with most of the land of Western Ukraine, the fertile farmland, now in the hands of the likes of Monsanto, they're going to need labor, and they'll have the capacity to bring people in to run their new plantations, and it's not going to be Ukrainians. So yeah, for economic reasons, they'll want to bring in the Africans, and obviously it's for those who just want rid of us. It's a gift, isn't it? It's a gift they gave themselves, those bastards.
It indicates, like, we get a lot of confused reports, as I'm sure you know too, of opposition in Ukraine. And the way they talk about opposition in Russia, I'm sure there are some Russians who may object to the war or whatever. There are certainly Ukrainians who object to the war. We don't hear of them. We do hear that there's been a lot of political parties banned in Russia, in Ukraine. There's been social groups shut down, union structures shut down, widespread arrests of people who they call oppositionists. I mean, this is the ultimate fantasy for our countries, that our leaders should have the same power to shut down dissidents as they're doing in Ukraine. Is there anything that suggests, perhaps to you, that there could be a real internal explosion in Ukraine, that there could actually be an opposition movement to the war that actually goes much more beyond words?
Well, I've seen the same little hints, Jim, as no doubt you have, in terms of mothers and wives coming out and demonstrating about the missing. And obviously the fact of so many political parties and organizations being banned, just self-evidently, if you're banning an organization, perhaps you break its power, but the people who followed that organization and believed in it don't go away unless you're going to shoot them all. And they haven't, as far as I know, been mass shooting people. So yes, there must be that there, but also it doesn't matter what we can see in this specific case. Bear in mind that everything coming out of Ukraine is extraordinarily tightly controlled. I think you just have to look at history, that in almost all wars, they start off with most people, especially all the young men, being all gung-ho for war, and the young women giving feathers to those who won't go, all the rest of it. But unless you win a war, even if you win a war, actually you get war weariness. If you win it, the number of strikes, for instance, that there were in Britain in the later stages of the Second World War was massive.
Yes.
Now, in the first part of the war, that was because the Communist Party, siding with Russia, which was allied with Nazi Germany, didn't want the war. But by the second half of the war, the Communists were desperate to boost the war effort as far as possible for the victory of Comrade Stalin and so on. So I think you take it from there that the strikes and the labour unrest in Britain towards the end of the war was organic, because people get sick of it, they get tired of the deprivation and the hardship and the uncertainty and the loss and so on. And that was a war which by that stage we, or actually the Russians, were winning very clearly. So in a state like Ukraine, where very clearly they are losing and the losses are just catastrophic, of course there will be a growing movement against the war. In fact, there'll be two, won't there? There'll be those who are against the war and want it stopped, and there'll be those fanatics who want to turn the war into civil war. You know, bear in mind that all of those Ukrainian nationalists, I spoke with many of them in about 2011, actual meetings with them in the European Parliament and so on. And what they were saying is that first of all, and then still had contact with them after the actual rebellion, the Colour Revolution, and they were saying in that, first of all, we will take control of the demonstrations, and then we will get rid of the government, and we'll work with the Liberals at that point. And once we've done that, we will get rid of the Liberals and we will take over government. So there's a significant element, and they're now hugely armed. Yes, a lot of them have died, but they've been acting as the political commissars, basically for the whole Ukrainian army for the last 3-4 years. And so they'll have replicated themselves to a degree. There'll be younger, even more crazy fanatics who believe that this war is only a stepping stone. And it's not only about beating the Russians, it's also about having beaten the Russians, shooting the oligarchs, exterminating the Jews, killing the liberals, hanging the homosexuals. That's all on their wish list. And the worse things get at some stage, then you'll get the myth, the stab in the back myth. Well, we could have won this if it wasn't for Zelensky and the oligarchs and the traitors and all the rest of it. So there'll be two elements within Ukrainian society at some point primed to go off against this war: the ones who want peace and the ones who want civil war.
So
and you can't discount also in Australia during the First World War, we had that issue with conscription. And you look what's happening conscription-wise in Ukraine. The conscription officers, driving down the road, they see a guy on a motorcycle, on a bicycle.
Press ganging.
And this has impact. They get no training. They're taken to the very front line. And I've seen a video. I can't attest for the authenticity of it, but because of the imprecation made by the leading soldier in it, I can only suggest it was genuine, saying, what are we supposed to do? This poor man doesn't know how to fight. He's just going to get killed. They're using him for cannon fodder. How can we win? And at what point is that going to, break the back of the women back home? And as you said already, they're already fractured into this group, that group. I would assume, though, the hardline nationalists you're speaking of would have been the ones throwing themselves into the front line. I'm sure there's a lot of them in the rear. But
some of them, there are two factors. Yes, some of them throwing themselves into the front line. But again, I reiterate the fact they've also been the political commissars, and their job is to provide the education, ideological indoctrination for people. And there's also consistent hints that they're being used as the blocking detachments, the ones who are further back, who shoot anyone who tries to retreat. So their casualties may not be as high as you would expect.
But the only reason they've got any clout is because the West enabled it.
Yes, the West enabled it.
If they're demoralised, and if Ukraine has to rejuvenate through immigration, such as we touched on, replacement, well, they're demographically going to suffer there too. They will not have the clout and their variety of nationalism will become even more minor, you know?
Oh, absolutely, but you don't expect to see logic, common sense, and rationality out of crazed Nazi satanic fanatics, do you? You know, I'm afraid that it simply doesn't go together. And Ukraine.
Sorry, Nick. Well, some of those groups, you go back, you remember, of course, the notorious World Anti-Communist League from 1960s and 1970s, and they had a lot of people, even in Europe, who were like that, albeit in the context of the time, who were like a shadow parallel force, shadowing genuine nationalists, I suppose. Kitson on a huge blackboard, not a small one. And there may be a risk, possibly, that that's what we'll have again. Perhaps an alternate, I suppose it's the wrong word to use, but I'll use it for the sake of it, an alternate to nationalism parading as us.
Yeah,
Would you see that?
I think so, bearing in mind also that, coming back to what you were saying about the problems of, especially the USA, you know, the Western money elite and the dollar imperium, there comes a point when you've got a crumbling economy, one way to keep it up is to make sure others crumble even faster. When you've got a crumbling dollar, one way to keep it up is to make sure that the pound and the euro crumble even faster. So the powers that be in the US intelligence community are, I'm sure, perfectly capable of unleashing their pawns, whether they're World Union type National Socialists or whether they're Islamist crackpots. They're capable of unleashing their pawns on the streets of the West in order to divide and diminish the West, in order to buy the United States a little bit more time. So
when you raised the point there just a moment ago about money, as you probably noticed recently, a lot of these other countries now do not wish to trade in euros or United States dollars anymore. And we remember Saddam Hussein with the golden dinar, Colonel Gaddafi with the African, whatever it was. They overthrew those governments and got rid of them. We now see, however, that there are larger countries, not always good countries, such as China and whatever, who wish to trade in their own currencies, fixed one against the other and so forth. This is a challenge for the dollar empire that hasn't existed before. And I would say it's got something to do with the exigencies of the Ukraine war, but this is a development of this war.
Yes, I go one step further than you there, Jim. I don't think this is a challenge for the dollar. This is the death of the dollar as the global reserve currency. It's not going to happen tomorrow. Might not, you know, it's not going to happen probably in 3 months' time, but it's inevitable. The way that things are going, the way the statistics are moving, the way in which, so just at present, the sections of the American elite and the EU as well, they're shaping up to barrack and abuse and bully and potentially sanction India, because India is making a vast amount of money buying cheap Russian oil, laundering it and sending it on to the West. And they don't want to, they don't want to stop. And there's also, of course, perhaps not the same scale as the Chinese, but still with the Indians, they've got very, very bitter memories of Western colonialism. And this is payback time. And certainly it's not time just to bow down and do what the white man says. You know, they've had enough up to here with European domination and American domination. So places like China, but also, say, potentially India, the more the Americans and the EU push them to do what they say when they no longer need to, because they're becoming the dominant economic and financial force in the world. They don't have to take orders from Uncle Sam or John Bull anymore. They can do their own thing, and they'll be very happy doing their own thing. And that's what I think means that the dollar imperium, it's not a matter of if it goes, it's when it goes. And when it goes, that means that the United States can no longer afford to police the world, have its military all around the world. So the question then, to me, the question which you can answer that, you can say that's going to happen, it's definite. The one thing we can't predict is what happens, say, to the puppet regime in Germany, which was imposed on basically in the West in the end by American by Soviet ones, and it's been kept up just as a puppet government for the people running the United States. And when the United States power just disappears, what happens to that elite then? Does it lose so much credibility and prestige that it goes down the tubes as well? Or is it able to reinvent itself? The historical parallel here, I think it's fairly clear that at the end of the Roman Empire, quite a lot of the regional Roman governors just reinvented themselves as barbarian warlords.
I was about to say that, actually.
That's what those governments will try to do.
Yeah.
But will they be able to succeed? And I think that the biggest change may not be in America itself, which could settle down just to being a badly flawed large country. I think the biggest potential change might be in the former satellites, where their master has gone. At the very least, you'll then surely see vicious infighting between different factions, different sections of the old puppet ruling class, because now they want it all for themselves. Fascinating time, isn't it?
It is. The Chinese say, about disorder under heaven. I think it might actually be a golden moment in history. In fact, some people are sort of vaguely suggesting, it seems to be creeping even into journalism, that perhaps this war, to quote Comrade Trotsky, that war is the locomotive of history, he said, may in fact be absolutely true. We've reached a civilizational moment, and it won't be the victim of this thing called democracy. It'll be the victory of something else. Not always something good either, obviously not.
Yeah.
But certainly when systems change from one to the other, you would never expect all good things to come out of it. Obviously so.
Yeah.
Well, the elites are right now discussing it all in Lisbon under the guise of the Bilderberg.
Yes, they're all there.
Not that we'll find
Happy
out.
chappies.
Not that we'll find out what's happening in there, because, of course, journalists are invited but not permitted to report on what's happening there. I was just going to make a point about India and China not having appreciated the big bad white man's imperialism. But ironically, it's thanks to British imperialism and, let's say, American money that India was lifted up in the first place, and that China has reached its economic prominence.
Mistakes.
I'm not drawing a conclusion out of that. I'm just saying that that the Western...
That was one of the negative things of imperialism noted a long time ago. India developed a textile industry and wiped out Manchester. That was the first example of it. It's not smart politics. None of it is. The Chinese, who developed China? We're supposed to forget who developed China.
Nobody considers the dialectic before they enter into it. But it must be said that the first stirrings of empire in Asia and etc. was also the first stirrings of the end of empire.
Well, someone else. Politics is a ruthless business.
So is success. I think the one thing that went amiss in the whole of the adventure was the concept of Western liberalism, which wasn't necessarily embraced throughout, but the technological uplift and the
Western liberalism
certainly enabled them. But there's a factor that we're all missing in all of this, and that is we're living in parallel to all of the fiscal realities. We're living in a digital age, and that brings us to artificial intelligence and the frightening possibilities out of that. And I was watching a Templar report that you were either streaming live on Twitter or something, and I introducing this, I'm running a risk because you might not recall what you said, because I can't recall what you said, but you were playing devil's advocate. I remember you said that, and you made this fascinating point about...
Yeah, okay. I'll come on to that. I do remember what I said, fortunately, Nathan. We're running quite late on time, so I'll try and keep it fairly brief. So what I'm saying is, obviously, if you went back perhaps 6 months, you had the likes of Yuval Harari, the ideologue of the World Economic Forum. Yeah. And they were all saying, and Klaus Schwab himself a year ago, they were all saying, oh, AI, it's this fantastic thing, and we're going to be able to merge human beings and artificial intelligence, and we're going to become the God man. Homo Deus, we're going to create a new species, etc., etc. We'll live forever. And now, just recently, Harari is now saying, whoa, wait a minute, this AI is potentially so powerful it might take over the world, and perhaps he, just like various of the high-tech bigwigs, are saying we need to rethink this. So my devil's advocate was to say this, that when people assume that machines, that artificial intelligence taking over running the earth would be really bad because they might not have our best interests in heart, you are presupposing that our current elites have our best interest in heart, which we know definitely they do not. So you had to raise the question, would an artificial intelligence elite be any worse than the elite which is actually trying to get rid of us? They're trying to get rid of us as a white race. They're trying to destroy Christianity. They're trying to destroy the very energy basis of industrial civilization. They're trying to turn us back into medieval peasants at best. So that ain't a good idea. Now, if you had a super intelligent machine, now those people are doing it for a mixture of things. They're in the grip of an interlocking group of crazed post-Christian religious millennial cults, of which the carbon thing is one of them. Plus, of course, it's about money, it's about power, it's about slaves, sex. It could be about all those things or some variation of them, because human beings want money, power, status, sex, etc., etc. What would a machine want? What would high intelligence want? And the only thing I can think that it would have a desire for is knowledge, specifically knowledge out there of the universe. What's out there? We want to get there. And for as long as human beings are necessary to help them in that, which I think will be for a very, very long time, then the machines need human beings. But a highly intelligent machine would simply wonder, assuming that we got to Mars in the 1960s, got to the moon in the 1960s, let's take that as a given. Some of your watchers may not agree, I don't know. Let's assume that the Yanks got to the moon. The machine would ask, why haven't we already got to Mars and beyond then? What's going on here then? And looking, the machine would probably come to two key reasons. One, the huge cost of the affirmative action program in the United States. And two, the fiat money banking swindle. If it wasn't for those two things, America would have had the money and the resources and the energy and the morale and confidence to already be on Mars and past that. So if a highly intelligent machine were to look at this, rather than thinking, yep, I'm going to carry on with the global elites operation to get rid of the white man, to destroy high technology, to plunge the world back into the Middle Ages and something even darker. No, it might decide affirmative action's got to go. The banking swindle's got to go. The parasite elite who are sucking the life, the skills and the energy out of the white man, and to be fair, the Chinese as well, in future perhaps, that parasite elite has got to go. And if a hyper intelligent machine with that much power decided that's what should happen, I guess they'd probably find a way to make it happen. So just perhaps we'd be better off run by an intelligent machine than the utter vermin, satanic humanoid scum who run the show at the moment.
That's a remarkable philosophic attitude, and I thank you for that.
and also never forget that artificial intelligence can't, dig the necessary minerals required to perpetuate the artificial species, and they can't. So that's definitely human labour. Well, this has been one of those discussions that you want to keep going because we can fly off into tangents and riff from there. But
another time.
I will bid farewell. Just as I stop after I stop recording, just hang around for 2 seconds and I'll have a word to you both. But I will say good night, and you can, or good morning, or whatever it is, wherever you are.
Good
evening from him and good evening from me, or whatever it was.
See you again soon, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure.